can the wisest man in history lose everything, even having absolutely everything? King Solomon received wisdom directly from God, ruled the richest kingdom of his time, and built the most glorious temple that Israel had ever seen. The Bible says that when the temple was finished, the glory of God filled the place with such force that the priests could not even remain standing. It was the highest moment in the history of Israel. But behind that splendor existed another reality. Solomon did not have only a royal family. He had 1,000 women, princesses, wives and concubines coming from many nations, each one with her culture, her gods and her influences inside the palace. How did life really work inside the palace of the wisest man in the world? And how did those same relationships end up changing his heart and moving him away from God? In this study, we are going to enter the real life of the Temple of Solomon, the functioning of his enormous harem, and the surprising human experiment that ended up revealing a truth that Solomon himself wrote at the end of his life, that even having everything the human heart can remain empty. If you want to discover how the wisest king of the Bible really lived and what lessons he left for us today, stay until the end. And if you like this type of deep biblical stories, subscribe to the channel and leave your like, because here we explore the details of the Bible that almost nobody tells. To understand how we got there, we have to go back. We have to understand the world in which Solomon was born, the father who formed him, the kingdom he inherited, and the night in which everything began with a question that God asked him, and an answer that changed history. Israel in the 10th century before Christ was a relatively young nation in terms of its current political form. For centuries, the Hebrew people had existed as a confederation of tribes united by a common faith, by the memory of the Exodus from Egypt, by the law delivered at Sinai, and by the Ark of the Covenant that traveled with them as a living symbol of the presence of God in the midst of his people. They did not have a king. They had judges, military leaders raised in moments of crisis, charismatic figures who appeared when the pressure from surrounding enemies became unsustainable. But there came a moment when Israel looked at its neighbors and wanted what they had. It wanted a king. It wanted a crown, a throne, a dynasty, a flag. It wanted to be like the nations, those same nations from which God had called them to be different. In the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 8, the prophet Samuel warns the people with crystalline clarity what a king will do. He will take your sons for his armies. He will take your daughters for his kitchens. He will take your fields, your vineyards, your olive groves, the 10th part of everything. He warns them that when that day arrives and they cry out to God for relief, God will not answer them, because they chose this. The people listen to the warning and ask for the king anyway. This matters. It matters because the Israelite monarchy was not born of divine initiative, but of popular pressure. God allowed it. God regulated it. In Deuteronomy chapter 17, he even left specific instructions for when Israel would have a king. 3 laws designed to prevent exactly what would eventually happen. 3 concrete prohibitions. The king must not multiply horses for himself. He must not multiply wives, and he must not accumulate silver and gold in excess. 3 clear rules. 3 direct restrictions. All 3 had the same purpose: to avoid that power corrupted the man who exercised it. To avoid that, the king became a pharaoh. To avoid that, Israel returned to Egypt not in geography, but in spirit. Saul was the first king, tall, imposing, exactly what the people had asked for when they looked at the kings of other nations. And Saul fell. He fell due to disobedience, due to insecurity, due to consulting a medium instead of the Lord, due to putting his reputation before the people ahead of his faithfulness to God. His reign ends with him dead on the battlefield, his army defeated, his sons dead next to him. Then comes David, David is the central figure who makes Solomon possible. Without understanding David, one cannot understand what it meant to be his son and heir. David is probably the most complex figure in the Old Testament. He is the shepherd who kills the giant when all the professional soldiers retreat. He is the musician who composes psalms of an emotional depth that continue to be sung 3,000 years later. He is the warrior who unifies the tribes, who conquers Jerusalem, who turns Israel into a real regional power. He is the man whom God himself calls a man after my own heart in the book of Acts, chapter 13. And he is also the man who sees Bathsheba bathing from the roof of his palace, who has her brought, who sleeps with her, knowing that she is the woman of one of his most loyal soldiers, and that when she becomes pregnant, instead of confessing, he orchestrates the murder of the husband. David is adultery and murder. David is Psalm 51, that prayer that can only be born from the deepest background of recognized guilt. Create in me, O God, a clean heart, and renew a right spirit within me. David is fall and restoration. David is the demonstration that God can work with a broken man if that man has a heart that returns. But the consequences of his acts do not disappear due to forgiveness. The prophet Nathan tells him in 2 Samuel chapter 12 that the sword will never depart from his house. And so it is. The son who was born of the adultery dies. Another son, Amnon, rapes his half-sister Tamar. Another son, Absalom, kills Amnon to avenge Tamar. Then he rebels against David, expels him from Jerusalem, and sleeps with the concubines of his father on the roof of the palace, in full view of all Israel, in a horrible and deliberate inversion of the scene from the roof where everything began. The house of David is blood and treason, is politics and daggers. It is the price that is paid when lines are crossed that should not be crossed. In that context, Solomon is born. He is born of Bathsheba, the same woman of the scandal, the mother marked by the history that preceded her. His name in Hebrew is Shalomo, derived from shalom, peace. He is the son of peace in a house that has known very little. There is something deliberate in that, something that the biblical text wants us to notice. This child born of a union that began in sin receives a name that speaks of what should have been, of what could be, of the grace that can redeem even the most complicated origin. The prophet Nathan gives him another name in 2 Samuel, chapter 12, verse 25. Nathan calls the child Jedediah, which means beloved of the Lord. God himself, through the prophet, tells this child, before he can do anything, before he has demonstrated anything, you are beloved, you are mine. There is an intention upon you. Solomon grows up in the palace of Jerusalem, in a court that for the standards of his time and region is sophisticated and powerful. His father has spent decades building alliances, winning wars, expanding borders. David has reduced the Philistines, has subdued the Moabites, has defeated the Arameans of Damascus, has placed garrisons in Edom in 2 Samuel. Chapter 8. There is a list of victories that, read in the context of the geography of the ancient Levant, represents a radical transformation of the map of power of the region. The Israel that Solomon will inherit is not the insecure tribal confederation that asked for a king in the times of Samuel. It is a state with structure, with an army, with administration, with a capital established in Jerusalem that David has chosen deliberately, precisely because it did not belong to any of the tribes, making it a neutral ground that could symbolize national unity. David has also done something else. He has gathered materials, has accumulated extraordinary amounts of gold, silver, bronze, cedar wood, worked stone. He has received plans, detailed instructions for a temple, because David also wanted to build the house of God. Or he wanted to be the one who solved what in his eyes was a theological discomfort. The Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred object of Israel. The physical presence of God among his people continued living in a tent, while the king inhabited a cedar palace. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, David says it to the prophet Nathan, "Look, I live in a house of cedar, and the ark of God lives among curtains." The moral discomfort that this generates in him says something about David, about his spiritual sensitivity, about why God loved him despite everything. But God tells him no, not you. There has been too much blood on your hands. The temple will be built by your son, and in that refusal there is both grace and restriction. God does not reject David. He tells him that what he desires to do, another will do, and that the throne of that son will be established forever. Solomon then arrives at the throne with an extraordinary inheritance and a specific task. He arrives with accumulated resources, with a consolidated kingdom, with a registered divine mandate, with a father who, despite all his defects, transmitted something essential to him, the knowledge of who God is and what it means to walk with him. In 1 Kings, chapter 2, on his deathbed, David speaks to Solomon with words that are almost a spiritual testament. Be strong and show yourself a man. Keep the precepts of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and observing his statutes, his commandments, his decrees, and his testimonies. What David asks of his son is not that he be a conqueror, nor that he be brilliant. He asks him to be faithful, and Solomon begins by being so. That is what makes what comes after so difficult to look at. But before wisdom arrives, blood arrives. Because kingdoms are not inherited without cost. There is an enormous difference between receiving a crown and really holding it. And Solomon learns it in the first months of his reign, in a way that leaves no room for illusions. The throne of David is glorious, yes, but it is also surrounded by men who have spent years accumulating debts, grudges, and their own ambitions. And some of those men believe with certain historical justice that the young king owes them something, or worse still, that they have more right to power than he will ever have. The first to move is Adonijah. We already know his story. The eldest son who almost made it, the one who lit the bonfire before time and was left without fire when Solomon was anointed. After the death of David, Adonijah does something that seems innocent, but that in the ancient world is everything but that. He approaches Bathsheba, the mother of the king, and asks her for a favor. He asks her to intercede before Solomon so that he gives him Abishag, the young Shunammite woman who had served David in his last years. In 1 Kings, chapter 2, Bathsheba carries the request to her son almost with naturalness, as if it were a minor request. But Solomon reacts with an intensity that surprises. He says to his mother, "Why do you ask for Abishag for Adonijah? Ask for the kingdom for him too, because he is my older brother." The logic in that world was clear. Whoever took the concubine or the wife of the previous king was making a declaration of succession. It was a political movement disguised as romance. Adonijah knows it, Solomon knows it, and Bathsheba possibly also knows it. That same day, Adonijah is executed. There is something that makes one uncomfortable in this moment. Solomon does not do it with visible rage. There is no dramatic trial nor a confrontation of brothers. It is cold, calculated, almost surgical. He sends Benaiah, the commander of his guard, and the matter is resolved. It is the first great sign that this king who loves God and who will seek wisdom as his greatest treasure also has an extraordinary capacity to make difficult decisions without emotion clouding his judgment. And that is a virtue or an early warning of something darker. History does not yet say it, but it registers it. After comes Joab, the legendary general, the man who had won the wars of David and had also committed the crimes that David never knew or did not want to punish. Joab had supported Adonijah during the coup attempt, which already put him on dangerous ground. David, in his last instructions to Solomon, had been explicit. Joab had shed innocent blood in times of peace. He had killed Abner and Amasa, and that debt could not remain unpaid. When Joab finds out that Adonijah has died, he runs to the tabernacle and clings to the horns of the altar, seeking the sacred refuge that tradition offered. Benaiah goes to look for him. Joab refuses to move, and then Solomon gives the order that in another context would seem impious. Kill him right there next to the altar. This is 1 Kings 2, and it is worth pausing for a moment, because this passage always generates debate. The answer that the text itself offers is that the altar was not created to protect murderers. Joab had sought refuge in the holy, not due to devotion, but due to convenience. And Solomon is not willing for the holiness of the place to be used as a shield for impunity. There is a coherence in that logic, although the image continues to be disturbing. And then, Shimei. This case is different, more nuanced. Shimei was the man who had cursed David when he was fleeing from Absalom, the one who had thrown stones and poisonous words against the anointed king of Israel. David had promised him that he would not die, but he had also left Solomon the task of finding the right moment to settle that account. Solomon summons him, speaks to him with a calm that results almost disconcerting and imposes a simple condition on him. He can live. He can stay in Jerusalem, but he cannot cross the torrent of Kidron ever. If he does, he will die. Shimei accepts, and for 3 years keeps his word. But one day, 2 of his slaves flee to Gath, and Shimei, without thinking twice, crosses to recover them. When Solomon finds out, there is no second chance. Benaiah appears again, and Shimei dies. What these 3 cases have in common is not gratuitous cruelty. What they have in common is clarity. Solomon establishes from the beginning that the rules of the new kingdom are real, that words have weight, that the debts of the past have expiration dates, and that the throne will not rule trembling. There is something in this that reminds one of what scholars call the consolidation of power, that brutal moment necessary in which an emerging leadership lets all the actors in the system know that things have changed for real. It is not that Solomon enjoys this. The text does not give that impression, but he does not avoid it either. And then, when the dust of those first decisions settles, something extraordinary happens. Solomon goes to Gibeon. At that moment, Gibeon is the most important place of worship in Israel, because there is the tabernacle, the place where the sacred utensils of the time of the desert are kept. It is 1 Kings, chapter 3, and the king offers 1,000 burnt offerings there. 1,000 is a figure that the text mentions without exaggerating the tone, but that speaks of a devotion that goes beyond protocol. Solomon is not simply fulfilling a coronation rite. He is looking for something. And that night in Gibeon, God appears to him in dreams. The question that God asks him is simple, and at the same time one of the most powerful that appear in all the scripture. Ask for what you want me to give you, a blank check, an offer without limits, whatever you want. Think about what that means for a king of 20-something years who has just inherited the largest empire that Israel has ever known, who has just stained his first months of reign with family blood, who has enemies on the borders and fragile alliances, and a people who observes him with a mixture of hope and skepticism. What do you ask for when you can ask for anything? The answer of Solomon reveals everything about who he is at that moment. He could ask for long life. He could ask for riches. He could ask for the defeat of his enemies. These are the things that kings wanted, the things that made sense in the ancient world. the things that any political advisor of the era would have recommended to him. Solomon asks for understanding. Give then to your servant a heart that understands to judge your people, to discern between good and evil. The Hebrew word that is used here, lev shomeah, can be translated as a listening heart or an obedient heart. It is not simply intelligence. It is the capacity to listen beyond the words, to perceive what is underneath the surface, to distinguish the truth when the truth hides behind appearances. Solomon does not ask for power to rule. He asks for the capacity to rule well, and that difference is everything. The answer of God is immediate and overflowing, because you asked for this and did not ask for long life nor riches, nor the death of your enemies, but discernment to administer justice. I give you what you asked for, and besides I give you what you did not ask for. Riches and glory like no king has had before, nor will have after. It is one of those moments in the Bible where the text seems to breathe differently, where the generosity of God not only responds, but exceeds, where the promise becomes so big that it almost gives vertigo. And then the account, with a notable narrative elegance, shows us immediately the wisdom in action. Not in a philosophical treatise, not in a royal speech, not in a state policy, but in a room where two women are fighting for a live baby, and each one points to the body of a dead baby. The case that appears in 1 of Kings, chapter 3, verses 16 through 28, is one of the most famous in all of ancient literature. Two women share a house. Each one has had a son. One of them, in the night, crushes her baby without wanting to while sleeping on him. And in the darkness, before anyone wakes up, she takes the dead baby and puts him next to the other woman, taking the live child in the morning. When the other woman wakes up to breastfeed her son, she finds a dead baby who is not hers. Both say that the live child is theirs. Both accuse the other of lying. There are no witnesses. There are no documents. There is no way to prove anything. Solomon listens to the case and then asks for a sword. Cut the live child in two and give half to one and half to the other. The silence that must have been produced in that room is one of the most eloquent in history. And then one of the two women speaks. The true mother. Because maternal love cannot contain that image, cannot tolerate the cold logic of that verdict. She begs the king, give her the live child, and do not kill him. The other, instead, accepts the division. Neither for me nor for you divide him. That difference says everything. Solomon points to the first. Give her the child. She is the mother. There was no DNA analysis. There was no prolonged judicial process. There was a radical understanding of human nature, a disposition to provoke the truth instead of simply looking for it. The lev shomeah, the heart that listens, had seen what no court would have been able to see, that true love prefers loss to destruction. And all Israel, says the text, heard the wisdom of this judgment, and they feared the king because they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice. It is the best possible start for a reign. It is the type of story that is told for generations. And Solomon at this moment is exactly what Israel needed him to be. What nobody knows yet is for how long that will last. Ruling a kingdom is not the same as dreaming of it. Solomon learns it fast. He inherited from David a unified territory, but political unity does not guarantee administrative efficiency. And a kingdom that is not ruled well is a kingdom that disintegrates from within before any enemy touches it from outside. So one of the first great decisions of the reign of Solomon has nothing spiritual nor poetic. It is pure bureaucracy. It is the decision to divide Israel into 12 administrative districts, each one with its own governor, each one responsible for supplying the royal table for 1 month a year. If you like the biblical stories that reveal the details that almost nobody explains, support this content with a like and subscribe to the channel, so you will not miss the next studies that we are preparing. The Book of Kings registers this with a precision that almost seems like an archive document. 12 districts, 12 governors, 12 months. The system is elegant in its logic. No region alone carries the weight of sustaining the court during the whole year, and the crown receives a constant flow of provisions without depending on a single point of supply. What turns out to be striking, however, is that the limits of these districts do not coincide exactly with the traditional tribal limits. Solomon does not divide Israel according to the sacred geography of the 12 tribes. He divides it according to the economic and logistical geography of the kingdom. Some tribes are left divided between different districts. Other regions include territories that historically belonged to Canaanite peoples already incorporated into the Israelite state. It is a reorganization that puts efficiency above tradition, and that, although nobody says it yet out loud, has consequences. Each governor must guarantee for his corresponding month a specific amount of provisions. 30 cores of fine flour, 60 cores of common flour, 10 fattened oxen, 20 oxen from the pasture, 100 sheep, without counting servants, gazelles, farm animals, and select birds. The biblical text details it because it wants the reader to understand the scale. This is not the table of a king of the desert. This is the table of a monarch of regional power with a numerous court, with officers, with guards, with foreign diplomats who spend weeks or months staying in Jerusalem. Feeding that system requires an organization that did not exist before. Solomon creates it from zero, and together with the administrative organization comes what no king can avoid if he wants to build something big: forced labor. The text calls it the mass, the mandatory levy. 30,000 Israelite men are recruited and sent to Lebanon in rotating shifts. 10,000 one month, 10,000 the next month, 10,000 the next. 1 month working, 2 months at home. Adoniram, son of Abda, is the one responsible for supervising this system. To that number are added 80,000 stone cutters in the mountains of Judea and 70,000 carriers who move the materials from one place to another. 3,300 foremen coordinate all these men. The numbers are so big that some historians question them, but the text does not offer them as rhetorical exaggeration, but as administrative accounting. Whatever the exact figure is, the human scale of the project that Solomon is about to begin has no precedent in the history of Israel. But before speaking of what is built, one has to speak of who this man is who is building it. Because Solomon is not only a brilliant administrator, nor a skillful politician, he is something more difficult to categorize. He is a wise man, and wisdom in the ancient world is not simply accumulation of information. It is a way of seeing the world that integrates what is observed with what is understood, what is known with what is lived. The text of Kings says that God gave Solomon wisdom and prudence in great measure and breadth of heart, like the sand that is at the shore of the sea. That image is extraordinary. It does not say that God gave him a sharp mind. It says that he gave him breadth, capacity to contain, an interior space so wide that it can lodge contradictions, mysteries, questions without answer and still keep standing. 3,000 proverbs composes Solomon, 100 songs. He speaks of the trees from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that sprouts from the walls. He speaks of the animals, of the birds, of the reptiles, of the fish. The biblical text is describing something that today we would call an encyclopedic thinker, someone whose intellectual interest knows no disciplinary borders. In the ancient world of the Near East, wisdom included botany, zoology, astronomy, ethics, jurisprudence, and poetry. Solomon is not a specialist. He is a generalist in the deepest sense. someone who sees connections where others see separate compartments, who finds in the conduct of ants a lesson about human foresight, who observes how the rain falls and understands something about time and patience, who looks at a king and sees his fragility, who looks at a beggar and sees his dignity, and the fame spreads. The text says that they came from all the peoples to listen to the wisdom of Solomon, sent by all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. There is something deeply subversive in this image. If one thinks well, Israel is a small kingdom, geographically compressed between greater powers, without an army that can compare with that of Egypt or the Mesopotamian empires. But Jerusalem becomes, during the reign of Solomon, an intellectual destination. The powerful of the ancient world do not come to show their strength to Solomon. They come to sit and listen. That is a radical inversion of the order of power. Military power impresses. The power of wisdom transforms. It is in that context where one has to understand the alliance with Hiram of Tyre. Hiram does not come to listen to wisdom, although he also respects it. Hiram is a Phoenician king, a man of business and politics, and what he offers Solomon is something that Israel does not have in abundance: wood. The cedars of Lebanon are in the ancient world what steel is in the industrial era, the material of construction par excellence, resistant, aromatic, durable, and enormously expensive, because the transport from the mountains of the north to Jerusalem requires an enormous logistical effort. Solomon sends a message to Hiram that the text preserves almost like diplomatic correspondence. He tells him that he wants to build a house for the name of the Lord his God, that his father David could not do it because he was surrounded by wars, but that now there is peace everywhere, and it is the moment. He asks him for cedars. He offers to pay what Hiram determines. The response of Hiram is immediate and enthusiastic. He rejoices much and says that blessed be the Lord today, who has given David a wise son over this great people. The phrase is notable because Hiram is Phoenician, not Israelite. He does not worship the same God that Solomon does. And nevertheless, he recognizes something in this moment that transcends religious borders, that the wisdom of a ruler is a good for all who live in his environment. The agreement that they seal is pragmatic and mutually beneficial. Hiram will provide cedars and cypresses from Lebanon. His men will cut the trees and will carry them floating by the sea until the place that Solomon indicates. Solomon, in exchange, will provide food for the house of Hiram, 20,000 cores of wheat and 20 cores of pure oil every year. An exchange between complementary economies. Israel has fertile agricultural land. Phoenicia has forests and technicians in construction. What one does not have, the other provides. And now the project takes concrete form. The temple that Solomon prepares to build is not simply a religious building in the modern sense of the expression, a place where people meet on holidays. It is something much more loaded with meaning in the theological and political imaginary of Israel. From the times of Moses, the presence of God had inhabited in a tent, the tabernacle, a portable structure that moved with the people through the desert. That mobility was theologically significant. God was not tied to one place. God walked with his people. But Israel is no longer a nomadic people. Israel is now a state with a fixed capital, with institutions, with delimited territory. And the question that floats in the air from the times of David is whether the presence of God can or should inhabit something permanent. David tried to propose it, and the prophet Nathan brought him a complex answer. You will not be the one who builds the house, but your son. That postponement was not a rejection, it was a redirection. And now the son is here with the resources, with the peace, with the allies, and with the political will to do it. The temple that begins to be projected is a theological declaration in stone and wood. God inhabits the midst of his people not as a refugee in a provisional tent, but as a king in his palace. The architecture is an affirmation of faith. Each block of stone that is placed is an argument about who rules the cosmos. Each beam of cedar that arrives from Lebanon is a testimony that the nations contribute, although without knowing it, to the purpose of a God who works through history. The men begin to move. 30,000 Israelites go up to Lebanon in shifts. The mountains of Judea resonate with the blow of 80,000 picks on the rock. 70,000 backs carry the weight of a dream that still has no walls nor roof. But that is already taking form in the mind of a king who was crowned almost by accident, who dreamed of wisdom instead of power, and who is now discovering that both things, when they are used well, are impossible to separate. What is being built in Jerusalem is not yet visible from afar, but the movement of men, the flow of materials, the weight of the purpose are already real. The most ambitious project in the history of Israel has just begun. The hands of thousands of men are put in movement almost at the same time. 30,000 Israelites work in shifts in Lebanon, 10,000 each month, cutting the cedars that Hiram of Tyre has promised. 80,000 stonemasons carve the stone in the mountains of Judah, and 70,000 carriers load the blocks from the quarries to Jerusalem. The total figure is almost impossible to imagine working in synchrony. But so it happens, because Solomon has organized this project with the same mathematical precision that he exhibits when judging disputes in his court. What begins to rise on Mount Moriah is not simply a building. It is a cosmology in stone. The dimensions of the temple are recorded in the first book of Kings with the exactitude of an architect. 60 cubits of length, 20 of width, 30 of height. Those numbers are not arbitrary in the ancient world. The proportions of a temple are a theological declaration. The proportion of 3 to 1 between length and width, the height that rises toward the sky. Everything communicates order. The order that God imposed on chaos when he separated the waters in the beginning. The temple is not a reproduction of the world. It is a representation of the cosmos ordered by the divine will. But there is something even more significant in its construction. The stones arrive at Mount Moriah already carved. The text says it with a precision that makes the skin crawl. In the work there was no sound of hammer, nor axe, nor any iron instrument. All the brutal work, all the noise, all the violence of the stone carving happens far away in the mountains. When the stone arrives in Jerusalem, it fits in silence. The place where God will inhabit is built without the rumble of human creation. There is in this an architectural reverence that no decree could have ordered better. The house of God is raised in the silence that corresponds to his presence. The floor plan of the building replicates and expands the design of the tabernacle that Moses built in the desert. There is an entrance vestibule, the Ulam, 10 cubits of depth, then the main salon, the Hekal, where the priests will minister each day, where the lamps will burn and the incense will be offered. And in the back, separated by a cedar wall and a double door of olive wood, the place that determines all the meaning of the building, the most holy place, the Debir, 20 cubits by 20 cubits by 20 cubits, a perfect cube. There is no other room in ancient religious architecture that has that proportion, that symbolism of absolute perfection in the 3 dimensions of space. It is the place where the Ark of the Covenant will rest, where the presence of God will have its dwelling among men. Inside the most holy place, Solomon orders to build 2 cherubim of olive wood. Each one measures 10 cubits of height. Their extended wings measure also 10 cubits from tip to tip, so that when they are placed one next to the other in the center of the Debir, their interior wings touch in the middle, and their exterior wings touch the opposite walls. 20 cubits of winged cherubim covering the totality of the width of the most holy place. Then they are covered with gold, all the gold that the olive wood can absorb, and they remain standing in the darkness of that interior room as eternal sentinels of the invisible presence. They are the same beings that Ezekiel will see later in a vision, creatures that belong simultaneously to the sky and to the earth. guardians of the threshold between the human and the divine. Here they are carved in wood and covered in gold, with their wings extended over the space where the ark will rest, where the stone tables that Moses brought down from Sinai will rest. And there is a deliberate continuity between those cherubim and those that God placed at the east of Eden to guard the path to the tree of life. The temple, in its deepest symbolic language, is an attempt to recover what Adam lost: the immediate presence of God. The interior walls are covered with cedar from floor to ceiling. Stone is not seen anywhere in the interior. The floor is covered with cypress wood. The cedar panels are carved with figures of gourds and open flowers, garlands and palm trees. Vegetation that reminds of the Eden Garden, the original abundance before the expulsion, and above all that cedar carved over each centimeter of that vegetable surface goes the gold. The text repeats it with an insistence that seems to want to record the image in the memory. Solomon covered the interior of the house with pure gold and put gold chains before the most holy place, and covered the house with gold inside. The gold is not here a superficial luxury. It is the materialization of the incorruptible, what does not rust nor wither, what remains when everything else is transformed. The interior of the temple is a visual argument about the eternity of God in the middle of a world that rots. It is in the middle of these 7 years of construction, the biblical number of fullness, the same number of days of creation, when God interrupts the constructive silence and speaks directly to Solomon. Not in a dream this time, but in the middle of the work, in the heart itself of the project. The words that he pronounces at that moment are the most important that Solomon will hear in all his life, because they contain the condition of everything that comes after. Regarding this house that you are building, if you walk in my statutes and do my decrees and keep all my commandments walking in them, I will fulfill with you my word, that I spoke to David your father, and I will dwell in the midst of the sons of Israel, and I will not abandon my people Israel. 7 years. The building takes exactly 7 years to be completed, and that number cannot be accidental for any reader who knows the sacred text. The creation of the world takes 7 days. The sabbatical year arrives every 7 years. The year of the Jubilee, that year of total liberation, arrives after 7 cycles of 7. 7 is the number of God, the number of divine completeness, the number that signals that something has reached its fullness. When the temple is finished, the number of years that its construction has taken is in itself a theological declaration. This work has reached its fullness. It is complete before God. It is worthy of His presence. But the stone and the cedar and the gold are only the container. What will fill that container, the objects that will give it its sacred function, requires an artisan of a skill that no Israelite possesses at that moment. Hiram of Tyre, the king, sends another Hiram whom the text distinguishes carefully. The artisan, son of a widow of the tribe of Naphtali, and of a father from Tyre. This Hiram carries in his blood both the Israelite inheritance of his mother and the metallurgical secrets of the Phoenicians by paternal line. He is full of wisdom, of intelligence and of science in all work of bronze. The text describes him with exactly the same terms that Exodus uses for Bezaleel, the artisan who built the tabernacle in the desert. The continuity is intentional. There is a line of artisans anointed by God to build his dwellings among men. Hiram, the artisan, is the link that unites the tabernacle with the temple. What Hiram creates in bronze is so extraordinary that it deserves its own chapter in the biblical record. He casts 2 columns of bronze that will be raised in the vestibule of the temple. 18 cubits of height each one, with capitals of 5 cubits more at the top, decorated with pomegranates in bronze chains. To the column on the right, he gives the name of Jachin, which means he will establish, and to the one on the left, Boaz, which means in him there is strength. Those 2 columns have no structural function. They support nothing. They are declarations. Everyone who enters the temple passes between them, between the affirmation that God establishes and the affirmation that in God there is strength. It is the theological threshold of the building, the text that every worshiper reads with his body before pronouncing a single word of prayer. Hiram casts also the bronze sea, one of the most extraordinary creations of the ancient world, a circular container of 10 cubits of diameter, 5 of height, with capacity for 2,000 baths of water. It rests on 12 bronze oxen, 3 looking toward each cardinal point. The border of the sea has the shape of a lily flower. Under the border, 2 rows of gourds cast with the same metal. The sea is so that the priests can wash, face, but its scale and its design make it into something more. It is a representation of the primordial ocean, of the waters that existed before creation, now domesticated and put at the service of the cult. The waters of chaos have become waters of purification. When everything is finished, the columns, the sea, the 10 bronze carts with their fountains, the gold utensils of the interior, arrives the moment that the whole project has been preparing. Solomon summons the elders of Israel, the heads of the tribes, the princes of the patriarchal houses. They come to Jerusalem in the month of Ethanim, the 7th month, the most sacred month of the Hebrew year. When the Feast of Tabernacles is celebrated, the moment is chosen with a liturgical precision that reveals that Solomon understands exactly what he is doing. The ark must enter its new home in the month in which Israel celebrates that God inhabited with them in the desert. In tents, in movement. Now that nomadic God is going to find his permanent dwelling, the priests lift the ark. They take it on their shoulders with the acacia poles covered with gold that have not been removed since Moses placed them. All Israel walks in front of the ark, sacrificing sheep and oxen in such quantity that the text admits that they cannot be counted nor registered. The procession goes up the streets of Jerusalem, goes up toward Mount Moriah, enters through the gates of the atrium, advances toward the vestibule, passes between Jachin and Boaz, penetrates into the Hekal, and the priests carry the ark to the interior of the most holy place under the extended wings of the 2 cherubim of gold. They deposit the ark there in that perfect cube of 20 by 20 by 20 under the wings that cover it in the most complete darkness of the building, more elaborate that Israel has ever built. Inside the ark, there are only 2 stone tables, the same tables that Moses put there in Horeb, where the Lord made a covenant with the sons of Israel when they left Egypt. All the gold, all the cedar, all the years of work, all the thousands of workers, all the wisdom of Hiram and the will of Solomon, all that exists to protect and honor those 2 stone tables carved by the finger of God. And then something happens that nobody has planned, something that no architect has designed, something that no liturgical protocol has anticipated. The priests leave the most holy place, and at that moment a cloud fills the temple. Not a cloud of incense, not the smoke of the sacrifices, a cloud that comes from nowhere visible, that has no human origin, that does not obey any priestly order. The cloud of the glory of God. The same cloud that guided Israel through the desert. The same cloud that descended on the tabernacle when Moses finished it. The same cloud that rested on Sinai when God spoke the commandments. That cloud fills now the temple of Solomon. It fills it so completely with a presence so dense and so overwhelming that the priests cannot remain standing to minister. It is not that they do not want to. It is not that they are paralyzed by fear, although without doubt they are. It is that the glory of the Lord has filled the house of God in such a way that there is no physical nor spiritual space for human weakness inside it. The divine presence has taken possession of its dwelling, and before that total possession, the human simply cannot sustain itself. When the silence that has fallen on the priests begins to be filled with something other than astonishment, Solomon stands up. He has been prostrate. But now he rises and places himself before the altar of the Lord, before the whole assembly of Israel. He extends his hands toward the sky. What comes out of his mouth at that moment is not an inauguration speech, nor a liturgical poem composed for the occasion. It is something rarer and more honest. It is a man who has built a house for God, and who in the moment of delivering it realizes that he does not know exactly what he has done. Lord, God of Israel, he begins. There is no God like you, neither in the sky nor on the earth. The phrase seems simple, but contains a theological confession that is going to structure everything that follows. Solomon is not celebrating the temple. He is from the first verse of his prayer relativizing the temple. Because if there is no God like this God, then no human construction can pretend to contain him, define him, nor much less domesticate him. The richest king of the world has just inaugurated the building more expensive of his generation, and his first public word is that that building is not enough. He says it directly with a clarity that defies any temptation of religious grandiosity. Is it true that God will inhabit with man on the earth? If the heavens and the heavens of the heavens cannot contain you, how much less this house that I have built? It is a question that sustains itself, without needing an answer, because the answer is already implicit in asking it. The temple is real. The presence is real, but the presence is infinitely bigger than any receptacle that human intelligence can conceive. Solomon built the best possible building, and the first thing he does with it is to confess its insufficiency. From there, the prayer unfolds in 7 requests that form a kind of map of the situations in which Israel will need mercy. 7 cases, 7 moments of breakdown, 7 scenarios in which a people can find itself without its own resources. The first is the most intimate, when someone sins who is innocent. The second is public and catastrophic, when Israel is defeated in battle for having sinned. The third is climatic and humiliating, when the sky closes and there is no rain. The fourth is devastating in its breadth: hunger, plague, locust, caterpillar, enemy inside the gates. The fifth opens the horizon beyond the chosen people, when the foreigner, the one who does not belong to Israel, comes from a far land, attracted by the rumor of this God, and prays toward this house. The sixth is military, but it has a different texture. When Israel goes out to war and prays looking toward Jerusalem. The seventh is the darkest of all, the one that Solomon seems to pronounce with special weight. When the people have sinned so much that God delivers them to their enemies, and they take them captive to a strange land, and there, in that exile, they remember and repent and pray from afar, looking toward this land, toward this city, toward this house. That seventh scenario is not hypothetical. It is prophetic. Solomon is praying, without knowing it, for a catastrophe that will happen 4 centuries after his death. When exactly that happens, when Babylon destroys this same temple that he is now consecrating, when the people are carried in chains to a strange land, when the survivors sit next to the rivers of Babylon and cry, remembering Zion. The prayer of dedication contains within itself the prayer of the exile. It is one of those moments in which the scripture folds over itself with a density that is only perceived in retrospect. The request that Solomon makes in each case is always the same in its structure and always the same in its humility. He does not ask that God does what the people deserve. He asks that God listens, that God attends, that God forgives. Listen in the sky your dwelling. He repeats with variations. Not listen here in this temple, but listen in the sky. Because the theology that sustains the prayer is precise. The temple is the place toward which prayers are directed, but not the place where the God who listens to them inhabits. The God who listens is in the sky. The temple is a direction. not a cage. The prayer ends with a vision that overflows the limits of Israel. Solomon asks that God keeps his eyes open over this house and night, that he attends the prayer of his servant and of his people, but also that he attends the foreigner, the one who comes from afar, so that all the peoples of the earth know your name, fear you, and know that this temple that I have built is called by your name. The universal vocation is there, buried in the center of the prayer, more specifically, Israelite, waiting to be discovered by whoever reads with attention. And then something happens that no eloquence could guarantee. When Solomon finishes praying, when the last echoes of his voice dissolve in the enormous atrium, full of people, fire comes down from the sky. Not a fire lit by the priests, not the slow and methodical fire of a human ritual. Fire that descends, that consumes the burnt offerings and the sacrifices. And the glory of the Lord fills the temple again, so fully that the priests again cannot enter. The people see it. All Israel sees it, and they fall on their face on the pavement, and they worship and they say, "Because he is good, because his mercy is forever." The divine response is not verbal, it is igneous. God does not pronounce an acceptance speech. God consumes what is offered, which is equivalent in the language of that world to saying yes, that he accepts, that he is present, that the prayer has been received. The fire is the signature of God on the contract of the dedication. What follows is a celebration that lasts 14 days and that requires figures that the modern mind has difficulty processing. 22,000 oxen, 120,000 sheep. Those are the animals sacrificed in the feast of dedication, not in the whole reign, not in a year, in 14 days. The numbers are so big that some readers discard them as Oriental exaggeration, but that dismissal overlooks its narrative function. What the text is communicating is not a statistic, but a scale. The joy is so overflowing and the gratitude so massive that there is no small figure that can represent it. Israel pours over God the most expensive thing it has in the largest quantity it can sustain during the longest time that the celebration allows. It is liturgy carried to the limit of what is possible. And before continuing, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because in this space we explore the mysteries, the stories, and the deepest truths of the Bible that many have never heard. The people returned to their houses at the end of those 14 days, and the text says that they left happy and joyful of heart for all the good that the Lord had done for David, his servant, and for Israel, his people. Note that the joy is not anchored in the temple. It is anchored in the goodness of the Lord. The building was the catalyst of the celebration, but the reason for the joy is more ancient and more personal. What God has done for David, what God has done for Israel, the long history of faithfulness that culminates in this moment. But that began much before, when the silence returns. When the party ends and the pilgrims disperse toward the north and the south, God appears again. The night, perhaps, or that liminal space between the end of one thing and the beginning of another. And God speaks to Solomon for the second time, just as he spoke to him in Gibeon at the beginning of the reign. But the tone has changed. In Gibeon, the voice was of offer and of generosity. Ask for what you want. Now the voice is of condition and of warning. And what it says has a structure that does not admit ambiguity. I have heard your prayer and your plea that you have made before me. I have sanctified this house that you have built to put my name in it forever, and my eyes and my heart will be there perpetually, up to their full confirmation, acceptance without reservations, but immediately, without pause, without a smoothing transition, comes the other. And if you walk before me as David your father walked, in integrity of heart and in equity, doing everything that I have commanded you, and you keep my statutes and my decrees, I will affirm the throne of your kingdom over Israel forever. The conditional if is there, enormous, structural, and then, with a precision that would be cruel if it were not necessary, God exposes the exact reverse. But if you and your sons turn away from me and do not keep my commandments, but go and serve foreign gods and worship them, I will cut off Israel from upon the face of the land that I have given them, and this house that I have sanctified to my name. I will cast out of my presence. The threat is not vague, it is architectural. The same temple that has just been consecrated can be rejected. The same land that was promised can be withdrawn. The same presence that has just filled the place with a cloud of glory can go. Solomon hears this at the same moment of his greatest religious triumph. The dedication has just ended. The fire has come down. The people have celebrated for 2 weeks, and God takes advantage of precisely that moment to say, all this can be lost, not as an arbitrary threat, but as a warning of someone who knows exactly the breaking point of that which has just been built. Because while the temple was being built, Solomon was also building other things. His own palace took 13 years, almost double the time that the temple took. That is not a minor detail. The temple was a declared priority, but the palace was a major investment in time, which reveals a real hierarchy that differs slightly from the proclaimed hierarchy. The palace complex included the House of the Forest of Lebanon, a structure 45 meters long, supported by cedar columns. Designed in part as an arsenal and in part as an apparatus hall, it included the porch of the columns and the porch of the throne, the place of judgment where Solomon imparted justice from an ivory throne with 6 steps and 12 gold lions. It was architecture at the service of power, built with the same excellence as the temple, but with a radically different function. And there was also a house built for the daughter of the Pharaoh, the Egyptian wife of Solomon, who had lived provisionally in the city of David, but who now received her own palace built with the same specifications as the other royal buildings. This detail passes quickly in the text, almost like a note in the margin, but its geopolitical weight is enormous. Solomon married the daughter of the Pharaoh in the first days of his reign, before the temple, before Gibeon. Almost the first thing he did as king was a strategic movement of an irrefutable logic in terms of human power. Sealing an alliance with Egypt through marriage was guaranteeing the southern border, accessing Mediterranean commercial networks, communicating to the other kingdoms of the region that Israel had the category of partner, not of vassal. But the problem was not Egypt. The problem was the principle, the law that God had given for the kings of Israel in Deuteronomy chapter 17, said explicitly that the king should not multiply wives for himself, so that his heart does not turn away. It was not a prohibition of getting married. It was a warning about the specific mechanism by which the hearts of kings had always turned away. The matrimonial alliances brought with them the religions of the wives, and the religions of the wives built alternative altars in the heart of the king, and those alternative altars competed with the only altar that mattered. Solomon, the man who had just prayed with more theological clarity than any Israelite before him, had already installed in his palace the first of what will be 700 wives and 300 concubines. The prayer of the temple was genuine. The Egyptian marriage was also genuine. Both things can be true at the same time, and that is exactly the crack through which everything that comes after will enter. The sea was always the border that Israel never finished crossing. For centuries, the ports were Philistine or Phoenician, and the people of the promise looked at the Mediterranean from afar, like someone who observes an inheritance that he does not know how to claim. Solomon changes that. Not suddenly, not with conquest, but with something more sophisticated, with alliances, with engineering, with money. And the result is a commercial network that converts Israel for the first time in its history into an economic actor of imperial dimension. The starting point is Etzion Geber. It is a port in the northern end of the Gulf of Aqaba, in what today would be the south of Jordan, near Eilat. Solomon builds a fleet there, not with Hebrew sailors, because Israel has no naval tradition, but with men of Hiram, king of Tyre, who know the sea as the Israelites know the desert. In 1 of Kings, chapter 9, verse 28, the fleet sets sail toward Ophir and brings from there 420 talents of gold. 1 talent weighs approximately 34 kilograms. That is more than 14,000 kilograms of gold in a single trip. Nobody knows with certainty where Ophir is. Somalia, Zimbabwe, India, Southern Arabia have been proposed. What we do know is that it was real, that the trip was possible from Etzion Geber sailing through the Red Sea, and that the gold that arrived was enough to transform the economy of an entire nation. Solomon not only receives that gold, he uses it, he invests it, he turns it into a symbol, because in the ancient world, the wealth of the king was not simply wealth. It was public demonstration of divine favor. It was the most powerful argument that existed to convince other kings that it was worth doing business with you, allying with you, respecting you. And then she comes. The Queen of Sheba appears in chapter 10 of 1 of Kings as one of the most fascinating characters of all the scripture, precisely because so little is known of her, and what is known is so extraordinary. She comes from the south, probably from the kingdom of Sheba, in what today is Yemen or northern Ethiopia, a region that in the 10th century before Christ was a commercial center of enormous weight, with spice routes that connected the Mediterranean with the Indian Ocean. She is not a minor figure. She is a sovereign, a woman who rules, who decides, and who has the power and the resources to organize a diplomatic expedition of that magnitude. Why does she come? The text says that she comes because she heard the fame of Solomon regarding the name of the Lord. That phrase deserves to pause. She does not come because she heard of the military power of Israel. She does not come because the architecture of the temple interests her. She comes because the fame of Solomon is linked with the name of his God. The wisdom of this king, that already circulates as a legend through all the commercial routes of the known world, is inseparable from the source of that wisdom. Solomon is not wise by his own merit. He is wise because God gave him wisdom, and that is precisely what attracts the queen of a pagan kingdom to cross thousands of kilometers of desert. She arrives with an enormous entourage, camels loaded with spices, gold in enormous quantities, precious stones. She does not come with empty hands, because in ancient diplomacy, presenting oneself without a gift was a humiliation for the host and for oneself. She comes to test. The text says it clearly. She comes to examine Solomon with difficult questions. It is not a courtesy visit. It is an audition, a test of intelligence, of wisdom, of character. And Solomon answers everything. There is nothing that is difficult for him to explain. Then she sees the temple, sees the palace, sees the table of his banquet, how his servants sit, how his servants are dressed, his cupbearers, the burnt offerings that he offers in the house of the Lord. And the text says something that seems almost a sigh. She was left breathless. The literal translation from the Hebrew is that there was no more spirit left in her. It is an expression of absolute astonishment. This woman who has ruled a kingdom, who has traveled through the known world, who has seen wealth and power, encounters something that exceeds her capacity for anticipation and says the words that have resonated through the centuries. What they told me in my land about your deeds and about your wisdom was true, but I did not believe it until I came and saw it with my own eyes. And even so, they had not told me even half. Your wisdom and your prosperity exceed the fame that I had heard. The half was not told to me. That phrase is theologically enormous, because what the Queen of Sheba is describing is not simply the wealth of Solomon. She's describing the glory that radiates through him. The text immediately connects her admiration with a declaration about the God of Israel. Blessed be your men, Blessed be these your servants who are always before you and hear your wisdom. The Lord your God be blessed, who was pleased with you to put you on the throne of Israel, because the Lord has loved Israel forever. For that reason, he has put you as king, so that you do judgment and justice. A pagan queen is blessing the God of Israel. A foreign sovereign is articulating the theology of the Davidic reign better than many in Israel. And Jesus, centuries later, will mention her as a witness. He will say that the Queen of the South will rise in the judgment with this generation and will condemn it, because she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. The Queen of Sheba becomes evidence that when the glory of God manifests itself genuinely, even those from outside recognize it. But there is something more in this story that makes it uncomfortable if one looks at it well. Because the same narrative that shows us the glory of Solomon accumulates the numbers, and the numbers tell a different story. 666 talents of gold per year. It is the annual income of Solomon in gold, according to chapter 10, verse 14. It is not the total of his wealth. It is the annual income. In weight, we are talking about more than 22,000 kilograms of gold entering the royal coffers each year, only in that item, without counting the spice trade, the tributes of the vassal kings, the business of the resale of horses and carts between Egypt and the northern kingdoms. The text describes an ivory throne covered with gold that has no equal in any kingdom of the earth. It describes 200 large shields of beaten gold, with 600 shekels of gold per shield, and 300 smaller shields with 3 minas of gold, each hung all in the house of the forest of Lebanon. It describes how the cups of the palace are of pure gold. Because silver was not considered anything in the days of Solomon, silver was as abundant in Jerusalem as the stones of the road. That detail about the silver is more than a literary image. It is an economic fact. When a precious metal becomes so common that it loses its character of scarcity, something has changed in the very structure of the economy, and that change has consequences. Deuteronomy, chapter 17. That is the text that makes all this not simply a story of success. Moses, centuries before, had given specific instructions for when Israel would have a king. And the instructions were precise because God knew exactly in which direction kings pull when they have power without limits. 3 prohibitions, 3 lines that should not be crossed. And Solomon crosses all 3 deliberately, completely on an industrial scale. First, the king must not multiply horses for himself, nor make the people return to Egypt to multiply horses. Solomon has 100 chariots of war and 12,000 horsemen. He buys them in Egypt and in Cilicia. The same text that describes his glory describes his disobedience without even lowering the voice. And Egypt is not a geographical detail. In the biblical imaginary, Egypt is the house of slavery, the place from which God took his people. Returning to Egypt, depending on Egypt, marrying Egypt, is moving in the direction opposite to the Exodus. Second, he must not multiply for himself silver and gold, 666 talents per year. Comment makes itself alone. Third, he must not take for himself many wives so that his heart does not turn away. This is where the story becomes more complex and more human, because the 1,000 women of Solomon are not simply a moral scandal. They are a political strategy. They are international treaties in human form. In the ancient world, royal marriage was diplomacy. When Solomon marries the daughter of the pharaoh, he is not choosing a wife. He is signing a non-aggression agreement, opening a commercial route, securing a border. When he takes Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, each one of those marriages represents a different kingdom, a different border, a potential threat converted into an alliance. The wife arrives in Jerusalem as a living symbol of the agreement, while she is in the palace. The agreement is in force, If she is honored, the agreement is honored. If she is expelled, the alliance is broken. Moab controlled the routes to the east of the Jordan. Ammon was north of Moab, in what today is central Jordan, Edom in the south, threatening access to the Red Sea and to Etzion-Geber, Sidon in the northwest with its ports and its wood, the Hittites in the north in what today is southern Turkey and Syria. Each one of those nations was a piece in the geopolitical board of the region, and Solomon moves all the pieces at once with the same systematic intelligence with which he built the temple, with which he organized the commercial routes, with which he answered the questions of the Queen of Sheba. The problem is not the intelligence of the strategy. The problem is what God said explicitly that should not be done, and the text does not allow any confusion in this regard. In 1 Kings, chapter 11, verse 2, it says that these women were of nations of which the Lord had said to the sons of Israel, "You will not go to them, nor will they go to you." Solomon knew what he was doing. He had the wisdom to understand the warning. He crossed it anyway. There is an architecture of the fall that is built exactly like this, not with a moment of weakness, but with 1,000 calculated decisions, each one with its reasonable justification, each one further inside a territory that God had marked as prohibited. The wisest man in history did not fall due to ignorance. He fell with eyes open step by step, treaty by treaty, woman by woman, year by year. The heart does not break suddenly. It bends. It inclines millimeter by millimeter toward that which seduces it, until one day you look and you no longer recognize the shape it had before. That is what happens to Solomon in the final years of his reign, and the sacred text describes it with a surgical precision that should freeze our blood. When Solomon was already old, his women inclined his heart after foreign gods, not as a young man, not in the peak of his power, in his old age, when one assumes that wisdom is already consolidated, when the internal battles seem won, when character should be like stone carved by decades of experience. It is then when he yields, and the word that the Hebrew text uses is important, gitu. They inclined. They did not force. They did not tear. They did not violate. They inclined, as a tree bends under the continuous weight of the wind, not due to a storm, but due to years of soft and constant pressure. Each woman brought with her a world, a language, a cuisine, a way of dressing, of smelling, of praying. 1,000 women are 1,000 distinct universes that enter the royal palace and install themselves in his private rooms, in their private altars, in their daily routines. And Solomon, who loved those women, could not simply ignore what they loved. Imagine the scene, not once, but repeated in hundreds of variations throughout years. A Moabite queen in her private rooms, with eyes red from having cried in silence, because she misses her land. She misses the smell of the rights of her people. She misses feeling the presence of her God. And Solomon enters and sees her like this, and the question is inevitable. What is wrong with you? And she tells him that she misses the festivals of Chemosh, that in Moab, at this time of year, there would be processions and songs, and the smoke of the sacrifices would rise to the sky, and she would feel that she belonged to something. And Solomon, who can give her palaces and jewels and gardens, perhaps the first few times said no. Perhaps the first few years he kept the line, but love has a way of eroding the firmest borders. And one day, the most powerful king of the earth lets build a small altar just for her, just in her room, just so that she does not cry. Just that. Just that is the mechanism of disaster. Because after comes another woman, and with each concession, the threshold moves a little more. What before was unthinkable becomes understandable. What before was understandable becomes acceptable. What before was acceptable becomes normal. The psychology of gradual compromise is relentless, and Solomon is not immune to it. Nobody is. The man who started by asking for wisdom from God, the man to whom God appeared twice, the man who built the most glorious temple of history. That man is yielding ground inch by inch until the ground that is left to him is unrecognizable. The gods that enter Jerusalem have names. The text mentions them, and it is worth pausing in each one because they are not abstractions. They are entities with stories, with rituals, with demands of blood. First is Astarte, the goddess of the Sidonians. They also called her Ashtoreth, the queen of heaven, the goddess of fertility and war, the morning star. Her cult was ancient as the moon and extended through all the eastern Mediterranean under different names. Ishtar in Babylon, Anat in Canaan, Aphrodite in Greece. Her rituals included sacred prostitution, ecstatic dances, and the adoration of the life force in its rawest form. The Phoenician women of Solomon, those who came from Sidon and Tyre, bring her with them like one brings a mother on a trip. Then is Milcom, also called Moloch, the abominable of the Ammonites. This name should stop us completely, because the cult of Moloch was not simply incense and prayers. The text calls it directly abomination. And the reason is that the sacrifices to Moloch in certain moments and forms the sacrifice of children. There is academic debate on the exact extent of this practice. But what the biblical text and the archaeological records confirm is that the Tophet, the place of burning, was a reality in the ancient Semitic world, and Moloch was his god. That Solomon builds a place of worship for this entity is not a sentimental concession to a wife who cries. It is a moral capitulation of abysmal dimensions. And after is Chemosh, the abominable of Moab, the god to whom Mesha, king of Moab, sacrificed his own firstborn son on the walls of his city when the battle was being lost. The text of 2 Kings registers it with a terrifying coldness. That is the god to whom Solomon builds an altar, the god of the bloody walls and the burned children, the man who asked for wisdom to discern between good and evil. But the most dramatic moment, or the one that condenses all the theological and geographical horror of the fall, is the construction of the high places on the mount that is in front of Jerusalem. Read the text of 1 Kings, chapter 11. With calm. Then Solomon built a high place to Chemosh, abominable idol of Moab, on the mount that is in front of Jerusalem, and to Moloch, abominable idol of the sons of Ammon, the mount that is in front of Jerusalem, the Mount of Scandal, as they would call it later. Today we know it as the Mount of Olives. Directly in front, with the Kidron Valley in the middle, is the Mount of the Temple. From one place you can see the other with total clarity. Solomon raises pagan altars on the exact site where looking toward the west. The first thing you see is the house of God. That geography is not accidental. It is an image that is worth more than 1,000 words. A spatial parable about what happens when double loyalty becomes visible in the landscape. The smoke of the altars of Chemosh and Moloch rose toward the same sky to which the incense of the temple rose. The prayers to Astarte mixed in the wind with the songs of the Levites. Jerusalem, the city of peace, the city of God, becomes the place where God and his antagonists are worshipped simultaneously on hills that look at each other from 2 kilometers of distance. It is at this point where the later tradition, the one that is preserved in rabbinic texts and in the rich literature that circulated under the name of Solomon, introduces an image that has the power of a perfect symbol, the ring, the legend of the seal of Solomon, that appears in the Testament of Solomon and in a multitude of medieval Islamic and Jewish traditions, tells you that the king possessed a ring with which he could summon, control, and cage the demons. With that ring, he had dominated the spirits that built the temple. He had put them to carry stones and carve wood and raise columns. He was Lord of the invisible. The seal had engraved the name of God, and its power derived from that divine filiation. While Solomon remained faithful, the ring was his. What he carried was delegated authority. The legend says in some of its versions that the ring was lost, that it was stolen, or that a demon who took his form for a time took it away, or simply that Solomon misplaced it. Like one misplaces the sacred when one stops taking care of it. And there is something in that image that captures what the historical text describes with more austere language. Solomon was the man who controlled what others could not even name. He was the master of occult and visible wisdom, and in the end of his life, on the smoking altars of the Mount of Scandal, he had ended up worshiping what he once dominated. The demons that once obeyed him were now in the form of their gods, the ones who dictated his actions. The king of the wise had become a slave of what he should have known to reject. The ring had disappeared, and with it, the authority that came from being aligned with the origin. God does not take long to respond. The text says it with a gravity that does not admit nuances, and the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Twice. The number is not there by chance. It is the measure of ingratitude. God did not appear to Solomon once like to many prophets. He appeared to him twice, spoke to him directly, gave him exactly what he asked for, and besides, warned him of the consequences of infidelity. Solomon did not fall in the darkness. He fell with the light on. The sentence is clear and without appeal, because there has been this in you, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I commanded you. I will tear the kingdom from you, and I will give it to your servant. And although divine mercy mitigates the immediate execution, not in your time, but in that of your son, and not the whole kingdom, but the greater part, for the sake of David your father. The verdict is already dictated. United Kingdom of Israel. The political masterpiece of David and Solomon has its days numbered, and God does not wait passively for the clock to run. He raises adversaries. The first is Hadad the Edomite, a prince of the royal blood of Edom who escaped the slaughter that Joab had executed decades ago. He grew up in the court of Egypt, married the sister-in-law of the Pharaoh, and when he knew that David and Joab had died, he asked for permission to return. The Pharaoh asked him what he lacked in Egypt, and Hadad simply said that he wanted to leave. He lacked nothing material. He had a pending account left over. He returns to Edom and begins to bother the southern flank of the kingdom. Then is Rezon of Damascus, a Syrian fugitive who formed a band, took Damascus and became king of Syria, adversary of Israel. All the days of Solomon, the northern flank also bleeds. But the most dangerous adversary does not come from outside. He comes from inside and has his own name. Jeroboam, son of Nebat, Ephraimite of Zeradah, servant of Solomon. The king himself had put him in charge of the works in the house of Joseph, recognizing in him a special capacity. He was young, valuable, visible. And one day on the road, he is intercepted by the prophet Ahijah of Shiloh. Ahijah takes his new mantle and tears it into 12 pieces. He gives 10 to Jeroboam and tells him that so says the Lord, I will give you 10 tribes. One will remain for the house of David for the sake of Jerusalem and David my servant. And the 10 are yours if you walk in my ways. The same conditions, the same contract. A new opportunity with a new man. When Solomon finds out, he seeks to kill Jeroboam, and Jeroboam flees to Egypt, where he is received in the court of the Pharaoh Shishak. There he waits. The history that Solomon began to write in glory is being finished by others, and the last pages will be written by the fracture. And then, almost without notice, Solomon dies. The text of 1 of Kings dispatches him in 3 verses, 40 years of reign. The temple more famous of the ancient world. The wisdom that made queens of distant lands bend the knee. The treaties, the alliances, the songs, the proverbs, the splendor that left speechless all those who witnessed it, and the sacred text closes it like this. The rest of the facts of Solomon and everything he did, and his wisdom, is it not written in the book of the Acts of Solomon? The time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years, and Solomon slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David, his father, and Rehoboam, his son, reigned in his place. That is all. 3 verses to bury a man who occupied decades. There is something deliberate in that brevity. The text does not grant him an epic death. It does not grant him a final speech of repentance. It does not show him returning in tears to the God who once spoke to him twice in dreams. It buries him with the same economy with which any king who ended badly is buried, and that alone is a judgment. What does survive is the problem he left, and that problem has a name: Rehoboam. The son did not inherit the wisdom of the father. This is not a late insult of history. It is simply what the text shows without need for commentary. When the tribes of the north approached Shechem for the coronation process, they did not come with gifts and songs. They came with a request, and behind that request, there were decades of accumulated resentment. Jeroboam, the man whom Solomon had tried to kill and who had fled to Egypt, returned to head the delegation. The words they used were direct. Your father made our yoke heavy. Now then, you diminish some of the hard servitude of your father and of the heavy yoke that he put on us, and we will serve you. It was not a rebellion. It was a negotiation. They were offering him loyalty in exchange for relief. They were giving him the opportunity to start his reign with a gesture of grace that would have sealed the unity of the kingdom for generations. Rehoboam asked for 3 days to consult. This is perhaps the last opportunity he had to do something well, and the way in which he wasted it says everything we need to know about him. First, he consulted the elders who had served Solomon, the men who knew the weight of government, who had seen how power works when it is exercised with intelligence. Their advice was simple and profound at the same time. If you are today a servant of this people, and you serve them, and you answer them, and speak good words to them, they will serve you forever. There is an extraordinary political wisdom in those words. The king who bows wins more than the king who crushes, because the king who crushes rules over slaves who wait for the moment to revolt, while the king who serves rules over people who will defend him when danger arrives. The elders knew this. They had seen it with their own eyes in the golden years of the kingdom. But Rehoboam was young, or at least thought like the young people who surrounded him, who confuse hardness with strength and clemency with weakness. The friends with whom he grew up gave him the opposite advice. So you will say to them, my little finger is thicker than the loins of my father. Now then, my father loaded you with a heavy yoke. I will add to your yoke. My father punished you with whips. I will punish you with scorpions. It is difficult to imagine a more stupid response from the political point of view. It is not only that it is cruel, it is that it is unnecessarily theatrical in its cruelty, as if Rehoboam wanted to ensure that nobody could confuse him with a man of mercy. The text adds a theological note that turns out to be revealing. And the king did not hear the people, because it was the design of the Lord to confirm the word that the Lord had spoken to Jeroboam. God did not cause the stupidity of Rehoboam, but he did allow its consequences to be what they had to be. Free will and divine sovereignty coexist here in that uncomfortable tension that runs through the whole scripture. The response of the tribes of the north arrived immediately, and arrived in the form of words that still resonate like a drumbeat in the biblical text. What part do we have with David? Do we have no inheritance in the son of Jesse? Israel, to your tents. With those words, the kingdom that David had united with blood and tears and decades of war and diplomacy broke in two. 10 tribes followed Jeroboam. 2. Judah and Benjamin stayed with Rehoboam. The line of David survived, but amputated. The promise of the Davidic covenant remained reduced to a fragment of what it once was. Rehoboam tried to send Adoram, the head of the tributes, probably to negotiate, and the tribes of the north stoned him to death. The king fled in his chariot to Jerusalem. The fracture was total, irreversible and bloody from the first day, and Jeroboam became king of the north of the kingdom that began to be called Israel, while the south, the kingdom of Judah, remained in the hands of Rehoboam. And here is where history gives one of those turns that make the heart sink. Because Jeroboam, the man who had received the prophetic promise to rule if he obeyed God, made a decision that ruined everything that could have been. His reasoning was political and perfectly understandable from a human perspective. If the people continued going up to Jerusalem to worship in the temple, their hearts would eventually return toward the house of David, and he would lose the kingdom. He needed his own cult, his own sacred place, his own religious identity for the north. And so he made 2 calves of gold and placed them, one in Bethel and the other in Dan. And he said to the people exactly the same words that Aaron had said when Israel was dancing around the calf in the desert while Moses was on the mount receiving the law. Behold your gods, O Israel, that made you go up from the land of Egypt. The same words, the same sin. 4 centuries later, in a new context with a new king, the cycle repeated with a precision that freezes the blood. It is no coincidence that the text uses the same words. It is a deliberate sign, an alarm that the sacred writer turns on so that any attentive reader understands what he is seeing. This already happened before and ended in tragedy and will end in tragedy again. Jeroboam, in addition, appointed priests who were not Levites. He established religious festivals on his own initiative. He altered the sacred calendar. He built altars in high places in his desire to maintain political power. He methodically undid everything that made Israel the people of the covenant. The scripture will remember him for centuries as the man who made Israel sin. And that phrase will be repeated like a somber refrain every time a king of the north is evaluated in the text. He acted in the ways of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who made Israel sin, a secular original sin transmitted from generation to generation, not by blood, but by imitation and convenience. It is at this point of the story, in this moment of fracture and repetition and accumulated tragedy, when it makes sense to turn the eyes toward a book that probably was written in the final years of the reign of Solomon, but that carries his voice in such a recognizable way that it turns out impossible to separate it from his experience. Ecclesiastes is one of the most strange, most uncomfortable, and most necessary texts of all the scripture. Its authorship is debated among scholars with the intensity that is usually reserved for things that matter too much. The book is presented as written by Koheleth, a Hebrew word that is generally translated as the preacher or the one who summons the assembly, and that the text identifies as son of David, king in Jerusalem, man of incomparable wisdom who tried everything. The identification with Solomon is so direct that it turns out impossible to read it as accidental. Perhaps it was Solomon himself in his final years. Perhaps it was a late disciple who took his perspective as a literary vehicle. What matters, in any case, is not so much the signature at the bottom of the document, but the voice that runs through it. No, because that voice is the voice of a man who had everything, who tried everything, who reached everything that the human being can reach in terms of power, wealth, pleasure, and intelligence, and who sat at the end of that path, and said the truth without trimmings. And the truth that he said is this: "Vanity of vanities," said the preacher. "Vanity of vanities. Everything is vanity." In Hebrew, the word is hevel, and hevel does not mean exactly what the majority of the translations suggest. It is not simply uselessness or lack of sense, although it contains something of that. The word in its concrete origin means vapor, breath, what dissolves in the air before you can. When the text says that everything is hevel, it is saying that everything is like the vapor of the morning, real, visible, for an instant, impossible to sustain. It is not nihilism. It is not the declaration of a man who has concluded that nothing is worth anything and that therefore everything is the same. It is something much more precise and much more disturbing. It is the observation of a man who has looked at reality without the illusions that normally protect us from it. And he has noticed that none of the things that human beings pursue with desperation has the permanence that it promised when we were pursuing it. This is radical honesty. It is possibly the most brave form of writing that exists, to sit and say what you really found at the end of the path, although what you found destroys all the consoling narratives that people prefer to hear. Solomon or Koheleth, or whoever it is who speaks in that book, did not reach this conclusion from the comfort of ignorance. He reached it from the other side of having tried everything. And what makes Ecclesiastes so extraordinary is not only its honesty, but the structure of its argument, because it does not stay in desperation. It starts there. Yes, it starts with the vapor, with the brevity, with the cycle of generations that come and go, and the sun that rises and sets, and the wind that turns, and the river that runs to the sea without ever filling it. But it starts there to arrive at some place. And that place, as we will see, is more surprising and more subversive than what any unprepared reader could expect. Ecclesiastes is not a book that is read comfortably. It is not designed to comfort. It is designed to destabilize, to push the reader toward an discomfort that, if it is sustained with honesty, ends up being more nutritious than any easy certainty. And the first thing that one has to understand is that this is not abstract philosophy written from an armchair. Solomon, or the voice that speaks in his name, that Koheleth, which means something similar to the one who gathers or the preacher, is speaking from experience, from the most expensive laboratory of ancient history, from an experiment that nobody else in human history would have been able to afford. The experiment is described with an almost scientific precision in the first 2 chapters. Solomon enumerates the variables with the coldness of someone who has taken notes. He tried wisdom. Yes, but then he decided that wisdom alone was not enough to answer the questions that took away his sleep. So he also gave himself to pleasure, to wine, to laughter, to everything that men pursue when they no longer know what else to do with their life. I said in my heart, "Come now, I will test you with joy, and you will enjoy goods." He built houses, planted vineyards, made gardens and orchards, and filled them with every kind of fruit tree. He built pools to water the forests. He acquired servants and maids. He had more cattle than any of his predecessors in Jerusalem. He accumulated silver and gold. He surrounded himself with singers and female singers and the delights of the sons of men. And then, with that capacity of his to look at his own life from outside, he notes, "I did not deny my eyes anything that they desired, nor did I turn away my heart from any pleasure, because my heart enjoyed all my work, and this was my part of all my toil." Up to there, it sounds almost like a satisfied hedonist. But then comes the turn, the twist that changes everything. I looked then at all the works that my hands had done, and the work in which I had toiled. And behold, everything was vanity and affliction of spirit, and without profit under the sun. In Hebrew, The word that we translate as vanity is hevel. Literally means breath, vapor, mist, something that exists, that you can see briefly when the air is cold, but that dissipates in seconds and leaves no trace. Hevel, it is not that things are bad. It is that they are fleeting to the point of irrelevance. They are real, but fleeting. They have weight, but no permanence. And that distinction matters enormously for understanding what Koheleth is saying. It is not nihilism. It is not clinical depression disguised as theology. It is a brutal philosophical observation about the nature of time and human existence. The most profound problem is not pleasure nor accumulation. The problem is wisdom itself. This is where the book becomes truly disturbing, because Solomon does not reach the conclusion that wisdom is useless. In fact, in chapter 2, he says explicitly that wisdom exceeds foolishness, as much as light exceeds darkness. The wise man has eyes in his head, while the fool walks in darkness. That is not in dispute. But then comes the question that has no comfortable answer. What is the use of seeing with clarity if anyway you are going to die? Because what happens to the fool will also happen to me. For what? Then have I been wiser? The wise man dies. The fool dies. And in the long term, warns Koheleth, with a coldness that freezes the blood. There will be no memory of either of the two, neither of the wise nor of the fool. Both will be forgotten equally. This is the crisis of Solomon, not the loss of the kingdom, nor the betrayal of his foreign wives, nor the divine punishment announced in the Book of Kings. The real crisis, the most intimate, is this: that the wisest man who had existed on the earth discovered that wisdom is not enough to give meaning to life, that you can see everything with crystalline clarity. You can understand the patterns. You can anticipate the consequences. You can build philosophical and legal and aesthetic systems of a dazzling complexity. And still, death arrives. Oblivion arrives, and the world continues turning as if you had never existed. And here is where the first chapter of Ecclesiastes takes all its theological weight, because Koheleth does not start with a personal complaint. He starts with a description of the cosmos. The sun rises and the sun sets and hurries to its place to rise again. The wind blows toward the south and then turns north, always turning, and the wind returns to its circuits. All the rivers go to the sea, and the sea is never full. What was, that will be. What is done, that is what will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. This description that seems merely poetic is in reality a cosmological declaration. The universe is indifferent, not evil, not hostile, simply indifferent. The natural cycles have no memory of human achievements. The Nile does not remember the pharaohs. The Mediterranean does not register the passage of the great empires. Nature has its own rhythms, and those rhythms do not include space for human glory. It is a thought that should paralyze us, but Koheleth turns it into something more complex. In chapter 3, he introduces one of the most famous passages in all biblical literature, that catalog of times and seasons that has been cited in weddings and in funerals, musicalized, tattooed on arms, engraved on tombstones. Everything has its time, and everything that is wanted under the sky has its hour. Time to be born and time to die. Time to plant and time to pluck what is planted. Time to kill and time to heal. Time to destroy and time to build. And continues during 8 verses enumerating 14 pairs of opposites that cover the whole human experience. The modern reader tends to interpret this as a kind of cosmic comfort, a way of saying that everything has its purpose, that bad things also pass, and eventually comes the good. But that is to misinterpret the argument, because Koheleth is not promising that evil will have its end. He is describing a structure of reality, that is completely outside human control. You do not choose the time arrives. You navigate within it, or you sink. But you are not the one who determines it. And nevertheless, and here is the twist that distinguishes Ecclesiastes from any purely pessimistic philosophy. That realization does not lead to paralysis. It leads to a kind of strange and austere freedom. If you cannot control time, if you cannot guarantee the permanence of your works, if not even wisdom can save you from oblivion, then perhaps the correct question is not how to transcend, but how to live well within the limits that you have. Koheleth repeats it several times throughout the book as a provisional but honest answer. Eat your bread with joy. Drink your wine with a joyful heart. Enjoy life with the woman you love all the days of the life of your vanity. It is not hedonism. It is something closer to radical gratitude. Appreciate what you have while you have it, precisely because it will not last. But there is another dimension in the book that is mentioned less frequently, and that reveals the particular loneliness of Solomon. In chapter 4 appears one of those verses that seem simple, but that have a depth that is not exhausted. Better are two than one, because they have better pay for their work. Because if they fall, one will lift up his companion. But woe to the alone, who when he falls there will be no second to lift him up, and continues with that image of the cord of 3 strands that is not broken easily. Community, friendship, companionship as an antidote to Hevel. It is a passage that acquires an almost tragic dimension when you remember who is writing it. The man who had 700 wives and 300 concubines. The man surrounded by servants and courtiers and musicians and builders. The man most accompanied of his generation. And nevertheless, in the moment of greatest intellectual lucidity of his life, he recognizes that abundance is not the same as company, that you can be surrounded by people and be more alone than anyone, that the most painful isolation is not the physical, but that of the man who has no one to lift him up when he falls. There is a verse in chapter 9 that sounds almost like a provocation, a phrase that could have been written by a Stoic philosopher or by a mathematician of the 20th century. Nor the smartest have the wealth, nor the wisest the favor, nor the most understanding the grace. But time and opportunity happen to all. In English, it is sometimes translated with that lapidary phrase, "The race is not to the swift. The battle is not for the strong. There are no guarantees. Merit does not determine the result. Time and chance, the mikra, the occurrence, what simply happens, impose themselves on all. This is not bitterness. It is a statistical description of human reality that any honest person who has lived long enough will recognize as true. And all this architecture of thought rests on a phrase that Koheleth repeats like a refrain throughout the whole book, a phrase that is in itself a theological concept, under the sun. 30 times that expression appears in Ecclesiastes. Under the sun, everything is Hevel. Under the sun, there is no advantage for the wise. Under the sun, oblivion swallows everyone equally. The preposition matters because what Koheleth is delimiting with that phrase is not the world in general. He is delimiting a horizon of analysis. Everything that exists and can be evaluated exclusively from within human experience, without reference to what may be beyond, without appealing to divine promises nor to future eternities. The experiment of Koheleth is honest precisely because it is confined to that horizon. He does not cheat, resorting prematurely to the comfort of the transcendent. First, he looks with all the crudeness possible at what is under the sun. And what there is when one looks without anesthesia is vapor. It is breath. It is a mist that appears briefly and then is not there. But the question that the book is preparing, the one that it has not yet answered fully, is if there is something that is not vapor, if there is something that is in some significant sense above the sun. The book does not end in the abyss. It ends with a voice that folds toward the listener, toward the young person who still has time, toward the one who has not yet seen how the body betrays, how the mind clouds, how the years take away what one believed was theirs forever. Rejoice, young man, in your youth, says Koheleth in chapter 11, and let your heart take pleasure in the days of your adolescence. It is not sarcasm. It is not the bitterness of an old man who laments what he can no longer enjoy. It is something more serious. It is the warning of someone who saw everything, who had everything, and who discovered that the present moment is precisely what escapes while one is busy accumulating. Vapor does not deny joy. It contextualizes it. It makes it urgent, and then chapter 12 arrives, which is one of the most extraordinary texts of all universal literature, disguised as poetry about old age. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years arrive of which you say, I have no contentment in them. What follows is an allegory so carefully constructed that commentators have debated its details for centuries, but whose general direction is unmistakable. It is the description of the human body that comes undone, image by image, with a precision that hurts precisely because it is beautiful. The sun darkens. The clouds return after the rain, without the relief that one expected. The keepers of the house tremble, the arms that no longer support with firmness. The strong men bend the legs that yield. Those who grind cease because they are few, the teeth that are missing. Those who look through the windows darken, the eyes that lose their light. The outside doors are closed, the ears that no longer distinguish the sound of the world. The voice of the bird rises, the sleep that becomes light, fragile, interrupted by anything. The almond tree blossoms, the hair that becomes white as the flowers of February, beautiful and terminal. At the same time, the locust becomes a burden, the weight of the own body, which before was instrument and now is obstacle. There is a tender cruelty in all this. Koheleth does not let us abstract ourselves from death. He does not allow us to speak of it as a philosophical concept from a safe distance. He forces us to see it in the concrete, in the trembling of the hands, not in the darkness that advances through the eyes, in the silence that installs itself where before there was music, before the silver cord is broken and the gold bowl is crushed, and the pitcher is broken next to the fountain, and the wheel is broken over the cistern, the cord that is broken, the bowl that is crushed, the life that is interrupted not gradually, but suddenly, at a moment that nobody can predict nor control. And then with an economy of words that is itself a kind of silence, and the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. There it is. The whole book converges on that line. Dust returns to dust. Spirit returns to God. Koheleth does not elaborate, does not explain what it means that the spirit returns to God. He does not give us a doctrine about life after death. He leaves us with the image. There is an origin. There is a return. And between the two, there is a life that can be lived with wisdom or without it, with awareness or in the fog, looking upward or looking only to the horizon. And what Koheleth has been arguing during 12 chapters is that looking only to the horizon, pursuing only what is under the sun, is pursuing the wind. Then arrives the conclusion, not as a betrayal of the argument, but as its logical culmination. The end of all the discourse heard is this: fear God and keep his commandments, because this is the all of man. Because God will bring every work to judgment, together with every hidden thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. There are readers who arrive at these lines and feel disappointment, as if the book had promised a radical honesty and in the end had chickened out, retreating toward conventional religiosity. But that reading misunderstands completely what has happened. Koheleth advances, What he says in chapter 12 is precisely what the argument of the 11 previous chapters makes necessary. Let us think about what he has demolished. He has demolished the illusion that work accumulates something permanent. Vapor. He has demolished the illusion that wisdom protects from suffering. The wise man dies just like the fool. He has demolished the illusion that pleasure satisfies in a definitive way. Everything passes. Everything is forgotten. He has demolished the illusion that human justice works in a reliable way. The just suffers. The wicked prospers, and the courts are full of corruption. He has demolished, in short, the possibility that something under the sun is the sufficient foundation for a life with meaning. And now he asks, given all that, given that nothing under the sun sustains the weight that we put on it, what is left? The answer is not nothing. The answer is what is above the sun, the Creator who is before the dust and after the dust, the one who brings every work to judgment, including the hidden things, those that nobody saw, those that power erased from the records, those that the injustice of this world buried without resolving. This is not religion as emotional comfort. It is religion as the only coherent conclusion after all the others have been examined and found insufficient. Koheleth does not reach God because thought scares him. He reaches God because thought leads him there. If everything is vapor under the sun, if injustice is not corrected in this plane in a reliable way, then either the universe is an absurd without redemption, or there is something else. And the judgment that Koheleth mentions in the final verse is not the judgment of the religious who have not thought about the problem of evil. It is the judgment that is missing precisely because human history is full of evil that remained without an answer. The affirmation that God will judge every work is the only affirmation that can survive the devastation that the book has produced in everything else. And here is where the life of Solomon becomes something more than a story of glory and fall. It becomes a demonstration. God took this man to the top of everything that humanity can reach. He gave him supernatural wisdom, unimaginable wealth, power without opposition, peace for decades, the privilege of building the house where the divine name would inhabit, and then observed with a patience that turns out almost uncomfortable how that same man took each of those gifts and rolled them inward, toward himself, toward his desires, toward his political alliances, toward his 1,000 women and his 1,000 altars to gods who had done nothing for anyone. The God of Solomon did not intervene with a lightning bolt in the moment in which the first altar to Chemosh appeared. He waited, warned through the prophet Ahijah, announced the consequences and fulfilled what he had said, but not while Solomon was living for the sake of David, for the promise he had made to a man who had died generations before. That patience is theologically significant. It is not indifference. It is the patience of the covenant, of a God who takes his commitments more seriously than his offenses, or who can sustain the tension between faithfulness to a promise and justice in the face of a betrayal, because he has the capacity to operate in times that humans cannot track from inside our own history. Solomon failed spectacularly, and nevertheless, the book that he wrote in his years of reflection has guided the spiritual and intellectual life of humanity for 3,000 years. That is not a contradiction that must be resolved by choosing between the man and the work. It is the image of how grace operates in the space between what a human being is and what he can in certain moments transmit when he is connected to something bigger than himself. But Koheleth is not the only book that bears the name of Solomon. There is another text, written possibly in his youth, or at some moment of openness that power had not finished closing, that is so different from the preacher that it is hard to believe that it came from the same man. The Song of Songs is a poem of erotic love, shameless, without apologetic allegories that domesticate it, without explicit moral lessons, A woman looks for her beloved in the city at night. He calls at her door, and when she opens, he is no longer there. The guards beat her. Love is strong as death, says the poem toward the end, and its embers are embers of fire. Flame of the Lord. It is the only time in all the song that the name of God appears, and it appears in a comparison. Human love has the intensity of divine fire. The tension between that poem and the life of the man who supposedly wrote it is almost unbearable. The one who sang about looking for the beloved in the night, about the love that no river can extinguish, about the door that opens too late. That same man accumulated 700 wives and 300 concubines. He built a matrimonial machinery of diplomatic relations, where each woman was a treaty. Each union was a negotiated border. Each body was a foreign policy. Where is in all that the woman of the song who says, "I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine"? Where is the love that is exclusive, that one looks for with desperation in the streets, that hurts when it is not there? Perhaps the song is the document of what Solomon knew that love should be and never could or never wanted to sustain. Perhaps it is the voice of what was left unlived. The poem he wrote about a fire that he then extinguished with political water. Or perhaps it is something more, the recognition that God designed human love as a reflection of something in his own character. A love that seeks, that waits, that knocks on doors, that cannot be bought with all the wealth of the palace. If a man gave all the goods of his house for this love, they would certainly despise it. The irony is that Solomon had all the goods of his house. He had them all, and with them he did not buy what the song describes. The two books together, the one of the vapor and the one of the fire, are the most honest portrait that exists of what it means to be a human being who knows the truth and lives anyway in the distance between what he knows and what he does. The story of Solomon is not an ancient story. It is the story of yesterday. It is the story of the man I know, that perhaps you know, that at 55 years old has everything he set out to have. The company he built from zero, the recognition of his industry. The house that his father never could give him. The children in good universities. The bank account that says he made it, and that sits in his office a Tuesday in the afternoon, looking out the window and feels something that he does not know how to name. It is not sadness exactly. It is more like the silence after a song ends, a question that nobody taught him to ask, because everyone assumed that the answer was obvious. And now what? It is not a crisis. Crises are dramatic. This is worse than a crisis. This is the quiet arrival at the top of the mountain that you climbed for 30 years, and the discovery that the view from above, although beautiful, does not fill what you expected it would fill. That the hunger that made you climb is still there. That it was not hunger for the top, or it is the story of the academic who dedicated 20 years to mastering his field, who published the articles, who won the positions, who is cited, respected, summoned, who knows more about his specific topic than almost any person alive, and who at 2 a.m, when the apartment is in silence, still cannot sleep. Not because he does not know enough, but because knowing is not enough. Because the mind that accumulates knowledge is the same mind that in the darkness asks questions for which knowledge has no answer. For what? For whom? What is left when I am no longer here? Or it is the story of the person who spent years wanting the relationship, the house, the title, the figure in the contract, and who finally got them, and who discovered with an honesty that hurts to admit that the wanting did not stop, that immediately after obtaining what he wanted, the desire had already moved toward the next thing, that there is something in us that is not satisfied, that the horizon always recedes exactly at the same speed at which we advance. Koheleth said it in a phrase, "The eye is never full of seeing, nor the ear of hearing," not as criticism, as diagnosis. as the most precise description of the human mechanism that has ever been written. We are creatures of insatiable desire. And the question is not how to turn off the desire. That is impossible and probably is not desirable. But what to do with it, toward where to orient it, in what to deposit the weight that we inevitably need to deposit in something. But before arriving at that question, we need to understand how we got here, because nobody arrives at the modern version of the collapse of Solomon suddenly. Nobody gets up one day and decides to build an empty life. The mechanism is more subtle and more intelligent than that, and understanding it matters because intelligence does not protect us from it. In fact, intelligence sometimes facilitates it. Solomon did not violate the 3 laws of Deuteronomy 17 in a day of madness. He violated them one by one, probably with reasons. The political alliances that required marriages with foreign women had real diplomatic logic. The horses were, in practical terms, legitimate military power. The gold was the natural result of the blessing that God Himself had promised him. Each individual step had a justification that a brilliant mind could build. And a brilliant mind will build that justification. And because a brilliant mind is precisely the most efficient tool to explain why the exception that benefits me is reasonable. You know it. I know it. It is the voice that says. In my case, it is different. It is the logic of the only. This time, it is the executive who has a solid and genuine code of ethics until the deal he faces requires crossing a line, and then he builds the argument of why this specific line in this specific context is not really the line that matters. It is the person who knows perfectly that he is using work as anesthesia to not feel what he is avoiding feeling, but who has 12 completely rational reasons to explain why this season of overwork is necessary and different from the previous ones. This is the pattern of all intelligence without an anchor, the capacity to justify anything we want to do with enough sophistication as to convince ourselves first. This is not a failure of intelligence. Solomon was the wisest man who had lived. This is a failure of surrender, the refusal to let limits define us, the deeply human, completely understandable resistance to accept that there are things we cannot have, paths we should not take, not because we are incapable, but because precisely faithfulness to those limits is what constitutes us as people, what keeps us being who we say we are. The limits that God put in Deuteronomy 17 were not arbitrary. They were not the restriction of a jealous God who did not want the king to be too powerful. They were the recognition that certain things, when you put them in the center, reorder you around them. The horses of Egypt were not just horses. They were a declaration of where trust was. The gold accumulated beyond need was not just prosperity. It was an identity built on a base that can disappear. The wives who bring their gods were not just relationships. They were the gradual dilution of what makes a life have coherence and direction. And now ask yourself, what are your horses of Egypt? I do not say it rhetorically. I mean it seriously. In what system of protection have you put your trust in a way that goes beyond the sensible and enters into what we could call existential dependence? Is it money? Not money as a tool. Money as a tool is perfectly reasonable. And if not money as the thing that, if you have enough of it, makes you feel that you are safe from the uncertainty of existing. Is it reputation? Is it the body that you keep in a certain shape? Is it the network of contacts? Are they the contingency plans over the contingency plans? Because the idea of having no control over what comes is unbearable. What is your gold? What is the figure that if you reach it, you believe that finally you will be able to stop being afraid? What is the number in the account? The title in the resume? The recognition from whom specifically that works in your imagination as the arrival? Because the mechanism of the gold of Solomon is exactly this. Not accumulation itself, but the identity that you built around accumulation. The I am someone because I have. The problem with building your identity on what you have is that what you have can go, and then, who are you? And what are your foreign wives? Listen to me, because this is probably the most universal of the three. I am not necessarily talking about relationships. I am talking about the pattern of looking for completeness in the accumulation of experiences, relationships, achievements, pleasures, whatever external thing that fills the space that you feel internally. It is the next trip that is going to give you the perspective you are looking for. It is the next relationship that is going to be different from all the previous ones. It is the next project that is going to finally give you the feeling that your life has the weight it deserves. It is the collection of anything, unread books, properties, recognitions, followers, experiences, that works as the attempt to silence with quantity what can only be answered with direction. And here is where Ecclesiastes becomes uncomfortable in a very specific way. Because Solomon did not reach his conclusion abstractly. He reached it empirically. He tried everything. He was not speculating about whether pleasure fills. He tested it exhaustively. He was not theorizing about whether wisdom is enough. He had it to the highest possible degree. When he says vanity, he does not say it like the moralist who never touched the world. He says it like the scientist who did the experiment with all the resources available and reports the results with brutal honesty. And the results say, it does not hold. It does not matter that it is the it. It does not hold the weight that you are putting on it. The question that leaves us is not religious in the sense in which many people understand the religious. It is not a question about rituals or memberships or affiliations. It is a question about architecture. What are you building? And when you finish it, when you reach the end of the project, when you reach the figure, when you get the title, when the relationship is what you want it to be, will it hold? Will you be able to put on top of what you built the full weight of what it means to be human? The fragility, the mortality, the need to be known, the fear, hope, love that cannot be guaranteed and that keeps standing. The invitation that Ecclesiastes makes is not to any form of religious performance. It is not asking you to adopt a different external posture. It is asking you for something much more difficult, that you sit with your own life in the way Koheleth sat with his, without the comfortable narratives that we normally use to not see with clarity. Without the, but I am better than without the I still have time to without it. Deep down I know what. With eyes open, with the honest question about whether what you are doing is what you want to be doing. If what you are pursuing is what you want to find, if the life you are building is the life that in your most honest moment you recognize as yours, that requires a courage that is not spoken of enough, because looking with clarity is terrifying. Comfortable narratives exist for a reason. The noise of constant busyness, the rhythm that does not allow pauses too long, the screens and the plans and the conversations that fill every available space. All that is not just distraction, it is frequently defense. Defense against the silence in which the questions we do not want to ask ourselves ask themselves. Solomon in the end let them ask themselves, and what he wrote in that moment of late clarity is what we still read thousands of years later, not because it is comforting, but because it is true. And there is something in us that underneath all the layers of noise and justification and busyness still recognizes the truth when it hears it and still needs it. Even if it costs. There is a phrase that Jesus pronounced, and that if you listen to it with attention, it stops you dead. He was talking to a crowd that had asked him for signs, proofs, evidence. And in the middle of that conversation, he said something that must have sounded almost scandalous to those who were listening. The Queen of the South will rise in the judgment with this generation and will condemn it, because she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And behold, something greater than Solomon is here. Matthew chapter 12, verse 42. A single line. But if you have been following this story, if you have seen everything that Solomon was, the wisdom without equal, the temple that stopped the breath of the ancient world, the glory that made kings send emissaries just to be in his presence, then you understand the weight of that comparison. Jesus did not say, "I am different from Solomon." He said that he is greater. And that forces us to ask ourselves, greater in what sense? Solomon was the highest point of the history of the kingdom of Israel. There was not before nor after someone who accumulated that combination of wisdom, wealth, power, and divine presence. The temple he built was not simply a religious building. It was the architectural declaration that the God of the universe had chosen to inhabit in the midst of his people. When the glory of God descended and filled that place in such a way that the priests could not remain standing, something had occurred that went beyond politics or religion. The sky had touched the earth, and nevertheless, Solomon failed. Wisdom did not save him from himself. The temple was not enough to anchor the heart of the people. 4 centuries after Solomon built it, the Babylonians reduced it to ashes. Nebuchadnezzar devastated Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, took the sacred utensils as war trophies. What had taken decades to build with the work of tens of thousands of men disappeared in weeks. And when the people returned from exile and built a second temple, that was also destroyed. This time by Rome in the year 70 of our era. The stones that Herod had expanded and beautified remained lying one on top of another, exactly as Jesus had announced. 2 temples destroyed. That is the history of what is built with human hands. Even if it is by divine mandate, even if it is with the best materials, even if it is with the best intention, it has a limit. It has an expiration date. And then something extraordinary happens in the Gospel of John. It is chapter 2. Jesus has just cleaned the temple, flips the tables of the money changers, takes out those who had turned the house of his father into a market. And the religious leaders, scandalized, demand a sign that justifies his authority to act like that. And Jesus answers them with a phrase that at that moment nobody understood. "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it." They thought he was talking about the building, and they mocked. 46 years it had been under construction, that temple. But John tells us with that narrative clarity that he has that Jesus spoke of the temple of his body. What Solomon built in stone and cedar wood and gold. What was the dwelling of the presence of God in the midst of the people? Had a fulfillment that no human architect could have designed. The body of Christ is the true temple, presence of God, not inhabiting in a building in Jerusalem, but in human flesh, walking the dusty roads of Galilee or sitting at the table with those who nobody wanted to sit, dying on a cross and rising on the 3rd day. That is what is greater than Solomon, not a wiser king in the same sense, although Jesus is also wise, not a bigger or more expensive temple, although what Jesus inaugurates infinitely surpasses that of Solomon. What is greater is that in Jesus all the things that Solomon pointed toward, but could not fulfill, find their definitive realization. Solomon was a shadow. Jesus is the substance that the shadow announced. The wisdom of Solomon pointed toward a wisdom that does not come from studying, but is a person. The glory of the temple pointed toward a glory that cannot be destroyed by any army, because it is not made with hands. The reign of Solomon anticipated a kingdom that will have no end. I have ruled not by a man who starts well and ends badly, but by someone in whom there is no shadow of variation. This does not make Solomon irrelevant. It makes him deeply necessary as part of a story that is bigger than any of its characters. And then we arrive at the end. Not at the end of the story that continues, but at the end of this conversation, and at the question that everything we have seen in the life of Solomon leaves open. Ecclesiastes ends, after all that philosophical and existential exploration, with something surprisingly simple. The end of all the discourse heard is this: fear God and keep his commandments, because this is the all of man, Koheleth. The preacher, the one who tried everything and found that everything was vapor, who arrives at the end of the path and does not present a complicated theory nor an elaborate philosophical system. He says, fear God, keep his commandments. That is all. But I want to be honest with you about what that means, because it is very easy to turn it into an empty religious slogan. Fearing God is not living with spiritual anxiety, walking on tiptoe to not awaken the wrath of an omnipotent and grumpy being. The fear of God in biblical wisdom is an orientation. It is the interior posture of someone who has decided that there is a reality bigger than his own self, more permanent than his own desires, more reliable than his own judgment. It is the recognition that you are not the center of the universe, and that is not a terrible news, but a liberating one. When Solomon had that, everything else worked. When he lost it and everything else started to come undone, not because God punished him capriciously, but because he was building on a foundation that could not sustain itself. In very concrete terms, today in your life, fearing God and keeping his commandments looks like this. It looks like letting limits define you instead of fighting desperately against them. It looks like building your identity on something that cannot be taken away from you. Not your position, not your bank account, not your achievements, not the opinion that others have of you. It looks like investing for real in the relationships that you have in front of you, not as transactions where you give to receive, but as places where you give because you chose to love. It looks like orienting your desires toward what lasts, instead of running after everything that shines and goes out. It looks like taking seriously the words that you already know are true, the ones you recognize even when you ignore them, not as religious performance, not so that they see you, not to build a reputation of a spiritual person, but as the basic architecture of a life that when the moment comes to review, it does not shame you. Solomon built one of the most impressive buildings of ancient history. It took 7 years, cost a fortune, was the central project of his reign, and was destroyed. And the second temple was also destroyed. But there are things that are built that cannot be destroyed. Paul, writing from a Roman prison, was telling the church in Corinth that each one should be careful how he builds, because the day will declare it, and the work of each one will be manifested. There are works that survive the fire. There are others that do not. The question is not whether you are impressive. The question is whether what you are building has the type of foundation that can sustain itself when everything else trembles. And that is the question with which I want to leave you. Not as an academic exercise, but as something I ask you to take with you alone in some quiet moment, and that you ask yourself seriously when you are at the end of your life and look back, and that moment will arrive, for everyone arrives. What do you want to have been building? Not. What do you want to have achieved? Not what do you want them to say about you in the obituary? What do you want to have built? What type of person do you want to have been? What type of presence do you want to have been for those who were close to you? Solomon had everything to answer that question well, and at some point on the path, he lost sight of it. The good news is that while you are listening to this, you still have time to answer it. If this story has moved something inside you, if there is a question that was left open for you or a reflection that you want to share, write it in the comments. Not because I need the numbers, although if you subscribe and activate the bell, you help enormously so that this reaches more people. But because these conversations are better when they are real conversations, when someone else tells you that he is also thinking about it, that she is also in the middle of that same process. And if you want to go deeper into the theological themes that appear here, the temple, wisdom, the figure of Jesus as fulfillment of the Old Testament. There is a Bible study section on the channel where we explore exactly those connections with more detail. The story of Solomon ends here, but the story that points forward, the one that is greater than Solomon, that one barely begins.